Why do people generally think that some actions are right and some actions are wrong?
Because as human beings, generally we grow up in a society, and through osmosis, we take in the cultural norms of that society. There we go. Video's done. I don't know what more you want. I don't know what else I could do. Is that an intro? What's up guys, Suris here, welcome back to my channel, and please hit all of the random buttons that YouTube wants you to hit. I'm saying it that way because that way it's timeless, so whatever random button YouTube wants you to hit in 20 years when all their standards change, just hit that one. Assuming my channel lasts that long. So apparently today we have a video from one Eric Loins, who is saying that atheism is contradictory at best. So I'm gonna go ahead and take a look at this video, but first, fan art section. So first of all, we actually have a couple of Rule 63 Suruses from Bumblin' Bee. One of them is in a more Powerpuff Girl style. And then finally, we have another Rule 63 Surus from Galactic Halo. Because apparently it's not actually a Surus episode unless there's either H or Rule 63. As always, everybody, thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's get right into today's video.
Why do people generally think that some actions are right and some actions are wrong, regardless of their subjective opinions? Why do most people generally believe that it's unfair for a known cheater to win a race at the Olympics?
Because we have prior expectations on what we consider to be fair, and we're raised around other people who have those expectations, who were raised around people before who had those expectations, who were raised around people before who had those expectations, who were raised around people who established those expectations. And if you thought that extreme close-up was uncomfortable, imagine what it's like explaining the same damn thing to the same damn people for years.
Why do most people believe it's evil or wicked for an adult to torture an innocent child simply for the fun of it?
Well, that one's actually pretty simple. Think about when you were a child. Think about your ability to understand anything around you, the world around you, hell, even why you were being punished. Just try to imagine the perspective for a second. And if you can, and then you realized you didn't want that to happen to you, congratulations, you already understand the answer to this question.
Or for a man to force himself sexually upon a woman?
Yeah, I love how you say generally accepted here, and yet there's actually a pretty large contingent of Christians who don't understand that marital rape is a thing. Almost as if there's a living, breathing group of counterexamples to your argument that generally people understand this. And those people are in fact Christian too, so they already believe in your God. But the question is still the same. How do we come to that understanding? Other human beings communicate to us that they do not wish to be sexually assaulted and would like to maintain autonomy over their own body. That's not very complicated. That's how you come to understand that that's not a good thing to do. Someone else has told you that they would not like it. And if you are to exist in a world where people will not do things to you that you don't like, it's generally a good idea to not do things to other people they don't like.
Why do people generally think that such actions are outright wrong?
Empathy. And for those of us that don't have the ability to muster up empathy due to some form of ASPD, they generally mimic empathy. Because empathy, even when mimicked, generally means that you can function better in a society. Because if you are putting yourself in other people's shoes in order to determine whether or not you would want an action to happen to you, it increases the likelihood that you'll be able to survive in that society. Because people won't do things to you that are as bad, because you're not violating them. But I gotta tell you, if your examples require a generally statement, then the fact that there are counterexamples in the Christian church of various varieties that don't agree with you already explains the problem with your statement. When you make these hasty generalization claims, you end up running into this problem, where either your statement about morality or fairness is so broad that it's easily explainable by 1,000 examples, or it's so wishy-washy in its broadness that it's easily knocked down by a handful of counterexamples. I've done both of those here so far, showing that when you use those generally statements, I can just point out that we have other ways of coming to those conclusions, or just accepting that other people didn't come to those conclusions, and then asking the question of why, especially why some Christian people didn't come to those conclusions. Either way is a nail in this coffin, but you haven't even really constructed your argument yet. That's not exactly a good sign.
Because most people, even many atheists, know that real, objective good and evil exist.
I don't know how many times I've explained this on my channel, even though my positions on this have changed. The first video that I ever did was on morality, where I straight up said that morality was subjective, and then I gave a whole bunch of examples. But that video was very poorly made. In fact, actually, I may do a video response to that at some point because I cringe at some of the arguments I made back then. I'm personally a moral anti-realist, which means I can believe in the idea of subjective and objective morality simultaneously, because even objective morality is contingent on subjectivism. If you look at something like divine command theory. Divine command theory is ethical subjectivism as it's contingent on the mind of God. It is always contingent on that mind. But to everybody under God in that hierarchy, it is not ethical subjectivism. It is objective morality. I'll be providing a couple of links down in the description below talking about different styles of morality, talking about the ethical subjectivism of divine command theory and all that other fun stuff if you guys want to get into some philosophical reading. But the fact of the matter is, the point that I'm trying to get here is that you don't need an objective morality to believe that something is right or wrong. Something can be right or wrong based on your subjective opinion. Or, like with the empathy examples before, something can be right or wrong based on the subjective opinion of someone else whose shoes you are attempting to fill for a moment so as to empathize with them. This is actually one of the counterexamples I've used towards the golden rule. I've had Christians try to explain to me that the golden rule is the best way to determine morality, because do unto others as you would want them to do unto you makes perfect sense. And intuitively it kind of does, but the reality of that is that what I want done to me and what someone else wants done to them are not necessarily the same. A better version of the golden rule would be to do unto others as they would have you do unto them. If I'm a masochist and I want you to rake your claws down my back, that doesn't mean that I should be raking my claws down other people's backs. They are not going to enjoy it the same way I would. Likewise, I can believe in subjective morality, but someone else can believe in objective morality, and that doesn't make one of us right and one of us wrong, because from the anti-realist perspective, if someone else believes in an objective morality and they have an object on which they base their morality on, that's still objective morality. That objective morality still exists. What Christians generally try to do, though, is they try to claim that objective morality is both a real thing, which I'm perfectly fine accepting, but it is also contingent entirely on God, which is divine command theory, ignoring, again, the fact that divine command theory is ethical subjectivism on its own, and ignoring the fact that you can have multiple objective moralities simultaneously, because the amount of objective moralities you can have are based on the amount of objects that agents can ascribe morality to. Christians trying to commandeer morality and argue that morality only exists within their framework is really dishonest. Here's a fun way to illustrate this example without using the Bible. If you believe in the ethos of Batman, specifically Jack Kirby's interpretation of Batman, you believe in the philosophy of the character, and you model your morality off of his philosophy down to the point where you choose not to use guns because you have a hard anti-gun stance, because you are modeling your morality off of Batman. You are engaging in objective morality. You are basing your morality on an object, the fictitious character of Batman. Now, for Jack Kirby, the author of certain versions of Batman, that is entirely subjective, because what version of Batman gets published during his era is up to him. It is down to his whim, much like with how divine command theory is ethical subjectivism to the deity. The problem that I see is that a lot of modern-day Christians try arguing that only their version of objective morality is valid. Only their version is true. Every other version of objective morality can't possibly exist at the same time. And then, of course, they have issues with subjective morality as well. But I think I've explained this particular concept a little too much. Let's go ahead and continue the video.
Although objective morality may be outside the realm of the scientific method, every rational person can know that some things are innately good while other things are innately evil.
Should I tell him? Should we get into the actual concept of what knowledge is? Because that's hell in a handbasket. That's an entire fucking video. That's an entire series of videos. That's an entire conversation philosophers haven't been able to agree on for over 2,000 years. The idea that actions have innate good or evil bestowed on them is generally a bit of a deontological perspective. Deontology basically argues that certain actions are right or wrong based upon a series of rules and not based upon a series of intentions ascribed to the particular act. The problem with this perspective, though, is that where deontology is concerned, when applied to ethics, you end up coming into a bit of an ought from is dilemma. An ought from is dilemma is whenever you have an ought, something you should do, but it comes first based on an is, so something that's established. For instance, if you say that slavery is wrong because it's illegal, then you are creating an ought from is problem. You are getting your ought, slavery is wrong, therefore we shouldn't do it, from your is, slavery is illegal. This creates a problem, though, because, for instance, if we talk about slavery, at one point slavery was legal in America. Did that mean that slavery was the moral thing to do? No. Generally, morality shifts first, and then laws shift with the morality of the populace. Likewise, if you try to base the morality of an action based on a series of rules, as with the deontological position, you end up having things ascribed to actions. Actions end up being innately good or evil based on whether or not those actions are determined to be good or evil in the set of rules you choose. Thing is, there's other ways of determining whether or not an action is good or evil that we use. Personally, I find that good and evil only really function as measurement devices. They're applied after the fact to an action. And the way we determine if an action is good or evil is a combination of the action's intended outcome and the actual consequences of the action. I'm not a pure consequentialist, and I also don't believe that the intent of an action is the only thing that matters. I think there's a mean between the two, and that mean determines whether or not the action was really good or really evil. And even then, that's a super simplified way of looking at morality. And generally, people have these very super simple black and white versions of morality in their head, because if you don't study things like ethics or philosophy, you generally have these kind of baseline views. And Christians like to prey on that. Not all Christians, mind you, there's plenty of Christians who don't do this, but Christians like the person in this example. They generally like taking the idea, this kind of base idea of morality that we have, and then arguing from that base knowledge, instead of trying to actually increase someone's knowledge on it. Like, for instance, if you actually look at one of these Christians and talk about something like moral anti-realism, they'll try to dial you back to that more simplistic version of morality that you might have once had before you actually studied it.
Atheist Michael Ruse admitted in his book Darwinism Defended that the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says that 2 + 2 = 5.
Right, let's go ahead and use my framework of morality, the mean between consequence and intent, and see if we can figure this out without moral objectivism. The consequence of the action of violating a child in this way was harm. Overt harm, that you've only caused harm, and that harm has been something that will cascade for years and years and years. There will never not be a time in this child's life, even into adulthood, where this action you have committed against the child has not affected them. So consequentially, there is a huge amount of damage, versus the consequence, one would argue, that this person got their rocks off once, which isn't even a good consequence. At that point, all they've managed is get 10 minutes, 5 minutes of pleasure, however much they get, versus the years and years and years and years and years of torment on the child. So consequentially, we already cannot argue that this is a moral thing. And then on intent, if their intent was self-gratification, that's not in and of itself a good thing. That's not in and of itself a pursuable virtue. And if the intent was harm, then this just compounds on the consequentialist issue. So even when using my version of morality, the means between consequence and intent, this anti-realist approach to morality, we still come to the conclusion that violating a child is incredibly wrong. We don't need objective morality to do that. We have a measurement device available to us in other moral structures that lead us to that conclusion. And that's not even necessarily moral subjectivism either. That's just looking at intended outcomes and end results. And whether or not something is a pursuable virtue can come down to a completely different measurement device we use called virtue ethics, where virtues are the means between two vices. For instance, a vice like self-starvation and torture, and then another vice like gluttony, there's a mean in between the two of satiation. You've ate enough to survive, and you're good to continue going. And then based on all of this, we would arbitrarily decide if an action is good or evil based on this, because good and evil, in my estimation, is really only functional as a measurement device. We were able to do all of that without objective morality. We didn't base any of those outcomes on a set of rules like deontology. We didn't base any of that on a set of laws or arbitrary commandments. We didn't do any of that. We just looked at measurements, outcomes, and people.
Philosophers Francis Beckwith and Gregory Kukul said it well. Those who deny obvious moral rules, who say that murder and rape are morally benign, that cruelty is not a vice, and that cowardice is a virtue, do not merely have a different moral point of view, they have something wrong with them.
Well, I have a disagreement with that quote, too. The argument that there are obvious moral rules in society is an argument from intuition, not logic. If something is obviously self-evident, whatever, that's generally a product of type 1 thinking. That isn't logical. Now, it could be correct and could be demonstrated via logic, but the base statement that there are obvious moral rules, that's not a logical statement. That is an intuitive statement. On top of that, if somebody is arguing that rape and murder are morally benign, they're going to have to logically construct that argument. And you just began with an argument against intuitive morals. I am against intuitive morals. I think morals should be constructed logically. But this is already a bit of a category error, and if I'm wrong, let me know in the comment section below. But to argue against type 1 thinking in the first statement, and then make a statement about type 2 thinking in the second part, that doesn't seem to be incredibly honest. That seems to be a bit of a bait and switch. But whether I'm right or wrong about that estimation on that particular quote, which I don't even know if it's being taken in the correct context, let's go ahead and continue the video and see what the ultimate purpose for him using that quote was.
Most rational people do not merely feel like rape and child abuse may be wrong. They are wrong, innately wrong. Just as 2 plus 2 can really be known to be 4, every rational human can know that some things are objectively good while other things are objectively evil.
Based on one's objective morality, those things can be considered good or evil, but again, not every measure of objective morality is the same. In fact, if you want to argue against something like murder, but then also be pro-military or pro-police force and their militarization, then you end up being in a contradictory position, being against murder unless the murder is against whomever you consider to be the right people. This is also ignoring all the cases of murder that have happened in the Bible as a direct result of God's actions, or even God's people. Sometimes commanded by God. But at the end of the day, we don't come to know that these things are good and evil because of a set of objective rules. We don't come to know these things because of that. We come to know these things through a variety of mechanisms. Some people have to have it explained to them via a set of rules. Some people end up having explained to them via logic, letting you actually step by step get to that point. Some people use the example that I gave before when you try to use consequence and intent and find a mean between the two. Some people do it via a system like virtue ethics, but they don't all use the same system to come to that conclusion. And to argue that everybody does use the same system to come to that conclusion is nightmarishly simplistic and flies in the face of anybody who's even taken a tacit study of philosophy.
However, reason demands that objective good and evil can only exist if there is some real objective point of reference.
In that, we agree. I agree that there are objective reference points that people use when constructing their moral positions if they are to use objective morality. I used an example of Jack Kirby's Batman. I'm sure you're going to use an example of the Bible, but let's go ahead and see if that prediction rings true.
If something such as child abuse can be legitimately criticized as morally wrong, then there must be an objective standard, some higher law which transcends space and time.
As I've done many times in this video, I'm going to refer to the example of measurements and the means between intent and consequences for morality, but I can also argue this position from the position of law, and it still not be something that transcends space and time. See, we have a set of laws in the United States, and whether or not an action is moral or not isn't necessarily determined by those laws. To argue that they are determined by laws at all is an argument from authority, and again, it is an ought-is dilemma. It is the case that the law is this, whether it's in space or time or not, therefore you ought do something. We don't determine the morality of an action based on those laws. But if you are to determine your personal morality based on a set of laws, those laws can be constructed from anywhere. They can be constructed from Like an example earlier, Jack Kirby's Batman. They can be constructed from the Bible or the Quran. They can be constructed from any number of texts or any number of examples. As long as you find that to be your objective reference point, that's what you do. But it doesn't have to be something that transcends space and time. It could be something that exists in your reality, much like the Bible exists in our reality right now. It doesn't transcend space and time.
Recognition by atheists of anything being morally wrong begs the question, how can an atheist logically call something atrocious, deplorable, evil, or wicked?
Guys, viewers of my audience, people who watch me usually, can you do me a huge favor? When you see positions like this, especially in this video, do it. Just timestamp when I explain morality. Just timestamp it. Like, and note, especially from an anti-realist perspective, that's not the only way to construct morality. That's not the only way to argue for it. But that's just a way to do it. How can an atheist possibly come to these conclusions without an objective reference point? I already explained. So just find it, timestamp it, put an H in there somewhere, I'm sure it'll work.
According to atheism, man is nothing but matter in motion. Humankind allegedly evolved from rocks and slime over billions of years. But whoever speaks of wrong rocks, moral minerals, or corrupt chemicals?
Well, we don't really argue that atheists evolved from rocks. Protozoa wasn't a rock. But that all said, you do realize that even though through nested hierarchies, we technically never stopped being whatever we were before. So in this case, eukaryotes, I guess that's as far back as we have to go to appease you. They never stopped being eukaryotes, but it doesn't change the fact that we are now sentient, sapient mammals. We're not arguing for corrupt eukaryotes. We're not arguing for corrupt minerals. We're arguing that sentient, sapient mammals can be corrupt, because that's what we are now. We still are all those things before. It's just we now have self-awareness. We now have the ability to construct laws. We now have the ability to construct rules and communicate to one another when we think that certain things are an infringement on our personal values. Those are things that come with sapience and sentience. Those are not things that come with simply being a rock or simply being a eukaryote.
People don't talk about morally depraved donkeys, evil elephants, or immoral monkeys. Dogs are not depraved for stealing the bone of another dog. Pigs are not punished for being immoral when they eat their young. Male animals are not tried for rape if they appear to force themselves upon female animals.
Right, because sapiens. Like, you're committing a category error here. There's a category of people who have the ability to construct these laws, communicate these ideas, and engage in these practices in a higher level. That's us. We are sapient beings. Homo sapien sapien. We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to create legislation, arguments, etc. We are in that category. Standard mammals over in this category, insects over in this category, anything that doesn't have sapience, that kind of self-awareness, that's over in a separate category. That is a separate thing. To argue that these are the same thing would be a category error, and that's not what atheists are doing. So what you're doing is engaging in a category error, and because it is not your category error, you're also engaging in a straw man. You're constructing a version of your opponent's argument that isn't actually the argument they're making. That's not honest. That is an incredibly dishonest position.
The fact that humans even contemplate morality testifies to the huge chasm between man and animals.
No, humans are animals. It testifies to the huge chasm between sapience and non-sapience. Animals over on this side may be sentient. They have the capacity to feel, perceive, and experience subjectively. Sapience, on the other hand, is the ability to have a deep understanding of knowledge of a subject. That is a quality that is uniquely human currently.
Simply put, the moral argument states, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Objective moral values such as good and evil, justice and injustice do exist. Therefore, God exists.
So it's a valid argument in that If you follow the syllogism, then yes, you would have to get to the conclusion that God exists, but it's not sound. The individual parts of the syllogism for the moral argument do not necessarily coincide with reality. First of all, if objective moral values exist, that doesn't necessarily point to a God. It doesn't have to. And then on premise 2, objective moral values such as good, evil, and justice and injustice do in fact exist, but they kind of only exist in an arbitrary sense. They exist in the way that ideas exist, that colors exist. These are things we can argue for, experience, write down, but they are not tangible things. They are things that exist in an abstract way. So even on both premises, you don't necessarily have the ability to get to your conclusion because premise 1 and premise 2 are not true. If they were both true and 110% foolproof, then yeah, this valid argument would also be sound. But it's not. I don't think I need to go through and restate everything I said about the different ways you can construct morality, even objective morality, in order to point out why this is wrong.
The moral argument for God's existence exposes atheism as either self-contradictory or outright appalling. You see, the atheist must either reject the accuracy of the moral argument's first premise and illogically accept the indefensible idea that objective morality somehow arose from rocks and reptiles.
This misapplication of the principle of entailment is honestly kind of appalling. So it's not, and I don't know how many times I have to say the same damn thing, it's not that morality is coming from rocks and reptiles. It's that morality is coming from sapient mammals who have the capacity for knowledge and wisdom, because that is the quality of sapience. That's a thing we have. Well, at least most of us have it. I feel like maybe you're a walking demonstration against my argument, but
Or he must reject the argument's second premise, that objective moral values exist, and accept the utterly repulsive idea that such things as rape, murder, and child abuse can never once be condemned as objectively wrong and evil.
And, like I said before, you can have people that accept that these things are objectively evil, but their objective reference point isn't necessarily the Bible, because it doesn't have to be. You can have people that accept that these things are incredibly evil based on subjectivism. You can have people that accept that these things are incredibly evil based on measurements, like I did. You can tackle this issue from an anti-realist position, from the position of moral error theory. You can tackle this from subjectivism, from objectivism. You can tackle this from DCT. It doesn't matter. There's so many ways to tackle this particular problem that arguing that yours is the bestest and extra most cheesy pepperoni is 10 out of 10 version, it doesn't matter. It doesn't get us to the conclusion that God exists. This attempt at constructing what is essentially a double bind, where the atheist is damned if they do, damned if they don't, doesn't reek of philosophical rigor. It reeks of laziness. It reeks of abusive tendencies. It reeks of dishonesty. But the one thing that I don't get from this is an argument that Yahweh exists. You see, I can actually take your argument and grant every bit of it, instead of just refuting the individual points because they are so sloppy in their foundation. I can take every single bit of your argument, and when I do, I can come to a conclusion of a different God existing. I can come to the conclusion that a deistic God existed, and they instilled these moral principles in the universe before fucking off. I can argue this position from any being sufficiently powerful enough to be considered a deity, not just Yahweh. And that's the real problem here. It's not just that your position is so sloppy it can be deconstructed on every single point. It's not just that there are so many different arguments on morality that you can't conclusively get to the conclusion you're trying to get to. It's not just that you're being willfully dishonest and trying to get people in a very, very abusive double bind. It's that even if we accept everything you said, even if we accept every part of your argument, we still don't get to Yahweh. We don't get to your God. This is ignoring counterexamples that could be used against you, like the logical or evidential problems of evil. This is ignoring actual counterarguments, accepting your arguments, don't get you to the conclusion that your favorite God exists. And to the Christians who try arguing for things like the Kalam cosmological argument and say that it's actually part of a two-step process, stop chugging William Lane Craig's dick, okay? The argument that I generally hear here is that, oh, even if it doesn't get me to my God, it gets you closer to my God, and now that you'll accept that a God exists, here's the Bible as evidence of everything my God has done, and now you have to be Christian. Except there's arguments against that one too, which means that you're still left up shit creek without a paddle. If somebody accepted this argument and became a polytheist, or became some other version of a monotheist, this wouldn't get you the Christian convert you're looking for, which I know is your goal. You're trying to either signal to the choir that you, in fact, know that all the atheists are really, really stupid, or you are trying to signal to atheists watching your content that they're engrossed in an illogical position. But you have the logic. You have the rationale. And other philosophers agree with you. You'll even quote mine them from their book without context.
What's more, if atheism is true, individuals could never logically be punished for such immoral actions, since they could not be proven to be inherently immoral.
No, we can use an evidential position to thwart this argument as well. We can argue from the premise that if human beings engage in certain behaviors, we are less likely to be a cohesive society. Certain behaviors lead to a more cohesive society. There are behaviors that deconstruct that society in a terrible way, like the ability to have wanton rape and murder. Therefore, denying those particular things is a good thing to do if we want to engage on a societal level, which would lead us to the conclusion that there are certain things we need to forbid, and logically can forbid, because we want to have a cohesive society of people that are not busy raping and murdering each other. Albeit this is taking a purely pragmatic approach. This is taking pure results-oriented data. This is just looking at end consequences of actions. This isn't even looking at intent. This is pure data. Nothing but logic, and we can get there without having to argue for any group of arbitrary rules, without having to accept things like deontology. We don't have to do any of that. We can just look at the data and see if society functions better when we do or do not allow certain things, and then we criminalize those things as we go forward, as we learn that these things are good or bad for the cohesive unit of the society.
If there is no God, then there is no objective basis to say that some things are right and other things are wrong. Reason demands that objective good and evil can only exist if there is some real objective reference point outside of nature. The only reasonable answer to an objective moral law for humans is a supreme, supernatural, moral lawgiver.
I like how you say that reason demands these things, but then you argue against a physicalist perspective or a materialistic perspective. Because if you are a materialist, if you are a physicalist, then reason would not demand that the logical answer is a supernatural God. Because your perspective, your epistemology, only has the things that are physical within it. You can even argue outside of a physicalist perspective. You can be a substance dualist, but also be an atheist, and you don't get to the idea that a supernatural, deified lawgiver is the one who made morality. That's not the only end result. Reason doesn't demand it, even if I accept a substance dualist position, which is largely what a Christian position would be. For those who don't know, substance dualism is the idea that what happens in the mind does not happen in physical reality. It happens in a substantive secondary area. The body is a physical area, and then thoughts are non-physical, and these things are distinct and separable from one another. The idea of a soul is compatible with substance dualism. But that is it for his video. I know that I have gone on way too long in this one. The runtime on this video is huge, but this is one of those philosophical concepts that I like talking about. Morality is such a long and winding conversation. You can have hours and hours of conversations on the subject of morality for years and never come to an actual conclusion, and I find that fascinating. But if you want hours and hours of reading, I will be providing some articles down below. Like I said, there's going to be an article on morality, an argument on substance dualism, an argument on materialism, all kinds of stuff Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a wonderful resource if you want to dive into any of the concepts that we talked about on this video anymore. Past that, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, please subscribe, please share with your friends, do whatever stuff you would generally want to do to a YouTuber's video if you really enjoyed it. I know that for my part, I am not actually as out of breath as I thought I would be. I guess I'm starting to recover. But we are at the patron section. These are the patron slides. If you want to support my channel and what I do, then please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. You can also do things via channel membership. Really, it's up to you which one you prefer. But either way, every bit of support you guys throw my way is incredibly awesome, and I thank you guys for every single bit of it. It is wonderful. That all said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I may have gone a little too long-winded in this one, so I don't know if that approach appeals to some of you or if you thought that that was terrible. But, you know, let me know in the comment section below. I'm sure if you hated it, you've already typed out how fat you think I am in the comment section. But, you know, you do you guys. Stay classy. That all said, as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.